The woman stood on my porch with a clipboard and the kind of smile that meant trouble. Behind her, two men in polo shirts nodded like trained seals as she spoke words that would haunt me for months. "Mr. Johnson, we are here representing the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. We need 63% of your forest land for a community access corridor." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. 63%, more than half of everything I owned. The 15 acres of pristine woodland that had taken me 20 years to save for. The sanctuary where I built my retirement dreams with my own hands. "You have 30 days to comply voluntarily, or we will be forced to take legal action." That moment, standing in the doorway of my cabin, I realized my peaceful life was about to become a war zone. What I did not know was that this woman, Corinne Matthews, had just made the biggest mistake of her life. 5 years ago, I thought I had found paradise. After decades of working construction in the city, dealing with traffic jams and concrete everywhere, I finally saved enough money to buy my dream property. 15 acres of untouched forest land, 2 hours north of the city, where the only sounds were birds singing and wind through the trees. The real estate agent called it raw land, but I saw something different. I saw freedom. Ancient oak trees that had stood for over 100 years. A small creek that ran clear and cold through the property. Wild deer that would graze in the meadow every morning like they owned the place. I spent 3 summers building my cabin with my own hands. Nothing fancy, just a solid 2-bedroom log structure with a wraparound porch where I could drink my coffee and watch the sunrise. The cabin sat deep in the woods, connected to the main road by a narrow dirt path that wound through the trees for almost half a mile. This isolation was not an accident. I chose this location specifically because it was far from neighborhoods, far from homeowners associations, far from people who thought they could tell me what to do with my own property. I had dealt with enough bureaucracy in my working life. Out here, I was the king of my own small kingdom. The nearest neighbor was Jim Peterson, a retired teacher who lived about a quarter-mile away. We would wave when we passed each other on the main road, but mostly we respected each other's privacy. That was exactly how I liked it. I spent my days hiking the trails I had carved through my property, photographing the wildlife, and working on small projects around the cabin. My evenings were spent on the porch, watching the stars appear through the canopy of leaves above. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly at peace. But peace, as I would soon learn, is a fragile thing. 6 months before that terrible morning, when Corinne Matthews appeared at my door, I had noticed some changes in the area. New construction equipment appeared on vacant lots about a mile down the main road. Survey teams walked through the woods with their instruments and clipboards. I did not think much of it at the time. Development was inevitable, I figured. As long as they stayed on their own property and left me alone, I had no problem with progress. My land was clearly marked with no trespassing signs and a sturdy fence along the property line. I owned my piece of paradise free and clear, with a deed that went back over 50 years. What I did not understand was that some people view other people's property rights as obstacles to be removed rather than boundaries to be respected. I was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter in my mailbox. Official-looking envelope, return address from something called the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. I had never heard of Pine Ridge, and I certainly was not part of any homeowners association. I threw the letter away without opening it, assuming it was some kind of marketing scam. That was my first mistake. The morning of October 15th started like any other. I was sitting on my porch with my coffee, watching a family of deer graze in the meadow, when I heard the sound of car doors slamming. 3 people in business attire were walking up my dirt path, moving with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you have authority over everyone you meet. The woman in the lead was tall and blonde, probably in her early 50s, wearing a navy blue blazer and carrying a leather portfolio. She had the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. The 2 men flanking her looked like they would rather be anywhere else, but they followed her like obedient soldiers. "Mr. Johnson," the woman called out when she reached my porch. "I am Karen Matthews, president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. These are board members David Kim and Robert Wheeler. We need to discuss your property." I set down my coffee cup and stood up slowly. "I am not part of any homeowners association, lady. I think you have the wrong address." Her smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. "Actually, you are now within our jurisdiction. The Pine Ridge community was officially incorporated 6 months ago, and your property falls within our boundaries." I felt a chill run down my spine. What does that mean exactly? Karen opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "It means that your property must comply with our community standards and regulations. We have conducted a thorough review of your land use, and we have identified several violations." Violations? I could feel my temper starting to rise. What kind of violations? "Your access road is not up to community standards." David Kim spoke up for the first time. "It is too narrow and presents a safety hazard for emergency vehicles." "Emergency vehicles have never had a problem getting to my cabin," I said. "The fire department and ambulance have my address in their system." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "That is not the issue. The issue is that your current access arrangement prevents us from creating a proper community corridor that would benefit everyone in the area." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Community corridor. "Yes," Karen said, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "We need to establish a proper access route that connects the new Pine Ridge development to the main road. Your property is in the ideal location for this corridor." "My property is not for sale," I said firmly. Karen laughed, a sound like broken glass. "We are not asking you to sell it, Mr. Johnson. We are asking you to donate the necessary land for the community good. Specifically, we need approximately 63% of your current property to create the corridor and buffer zones." The words hit me like a physical blow. 63%, more than half of everything I owned. The meadow where the deer grazed, the creek that ran through the heart of my property, the hiking trails I had spent years perfecting. "You have got to be kidding me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am completely serious," Karen replied. "This is not a request, Mr. Johnson. This is a requirement under our community covenant. You have 30 days to comply voluntarily, or we will be forced to take legal action to acquire the necessary land through eminent domain." "Eminent domain?" I felt the blood draining from my face. "You are not the government. You cannot just take my land." Robert Wheeler stepped forward, speaking for the first time. "Actually, we can. The Pine Ridge Homeowners Association has been granted certain municipal powers by the county. We have the legal authority to acquire land for community infrastructure projects." I looked at all 3 of them, trying to understand how this was happening. This is insane. I bought this land specifically to get away from this kind of bureaucratic nonsense. I am not part of your community, and I never agreed to any of this. Karen's smile disappeared completely. Whether you agreed to it or not is irrelevant. You are now subject to our authority. You can cooperate voluntarily, or we can make this process very difficult for you. The choice is yours. She placed a thick envelope on my porch railing. This contains all the relevant documentation, including the legal notice and timeline. I suggest you read it carefully and consider your options. We will be back in 30 days for your answer. The three of them turned and walked away, leaving me standing on my porch holding an envelope that felt like it contained a death sentence. I watched them disappear down my dirt path, my hands shaking with rage and disbelief. 63% of my land. For a corridor to benefit people I had never met, living in houses I had never seen, who apparently thought they could just take whatever they wanted from their neighbors. That was the moment I realized that my peaceful retirement was over, and the fight of my life was about to begin. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the envelope Karen had left, afraid to open it, but knowing I had no choice. The documents inside were even worse than I had imagined. 23 pages of legal jargon, maps, and official-looking stamps that painted a picture of systematic theft disguised as community development. The first document was a notice of incorporation for the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, dated 6 months earlier. According to the paperwork, they had been granted authority over a 2-square-mile area that included my property, even though I had never been notified or asked for my consent. The second document was a community master plan that showed my 15 acres divided into 3 sections. The largest section, labeled Community Access Corridor, covered more than half of my property, including the meadow and the creek. A smaller section was marked Buffer Zone, which included most of my hiking trails. The tiny remaining portion, labeled Grandfathered Residential, contained only my cabin and about 2 acres of surrounding woods. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could about homeowners associations and property rights. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The Pine Ridge HOA had been formed by a group of wealthy developers who had purchased large tracts of land in the area for a luxury housing development. They had used a loophole in state law that allowed them to incorporate as a quasi-municipal entity, giving them powers normally reserved for city governments. The more I dug into public records, the clearer their scheme became. They had bought up most of the undeveloped land in the area at below-market prices, then created the HOA to force existing property owners like me to surrender our land for their development projects. My forest corridor would increase the value of their luxury homes by millions of dollars, while costing me everything I had worked for. I discovered that I was not their first victim. 3 other long-time residents had already been pressured into selling their properties for a fraction of their value rather than fight the HOA in court. One elderly couple had lost their family farm that had been in their family for 4 generations. Another man had been forced to sell his lakefront cabin after the HOA claimed they needed the shoreline for a community boat launch. The harassment began almost immediately. Every day brought new certified letters from the HOA, each one containing new demands and threats. They claimed my cabin was not up to building codes. They said my dirt road was an environmental hazard. They demanded access to my property for inspections and surveys. Karen Matthews called me twice a day, always with the same message. "Mr. Johnson, this will be much easier if you just cooperate. We are trying to work with you, but our patience is not unlimited." I started keeping a journal of every interaction, every phone call, every letter. I had a feeling I was going to need evidence of their harassment campaign. 2 weeks after that first visit, I was working in my garden when I heard voices in the woods. I walked toward the sound and found two men in hard hats surveying my property line. They had orange flags marking trees and measuring distances with professional equipment. "Hey," I called out, "what are you doing on my land?" One of them looked up from his instrument. "We are conducting a preliminary survey for the Community Access Project. We have authorization from the Pine Ridge HOA. "You do not have authorization from me," I said, walking toward them. "This is private property and you are trespassing." The man shrugged. "Take it up with the HOA. We are just doing our job." I called the sheriff's office, but the deputy who responded seemed reluctant to get involved. "It is really a civil matter, sir. If you have a dispute with the HOA, you need to work it out through the proper channels." That night, I sat on my porch and looked out at the meadow where the deer used to graze. They had stopped coming since the surveying began. Even the animals could sense that something was wrong. I realized that these people were not going to stop. They had money, lawyers, and apparently the backing of local government. I was just one man with a small savings account and a stubborn streak. But I had something they did not expect. I had nothing left to lose, and I was not going to go down without a fight. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and disappointment. Sarah Chen, the property rights attorney I had found through 3 days of desperate phone calls, sat across from me with the HOA documents spread across her mahogany desk. She was young, maybe in her early 30s, but her reputation for fighting municipal overreach had impressed me during our phone consultation. "Mr. Johnson," she said, looking up from the paperwork, "I am going to be completely honest with you. This is going to be expensive and it is going to be ugly. The Pine Ridge HOA has deep pockets and a team of lawyers who specialize in these kinds of land acquisitions." I leaned forward in my chair. "Can they really take my land?" Sarah sighed. "The legal framework they are using is questionable at best. The problem is that they have positioned themselves as a quasi-governmental entity, which gives them certain powers of eminent domain. However, there are strict requirements for how these powers can be used, and based on what I am seeing here, they may have violated several procedural requirements." "What kind of violations?" "First, they never properly notified existing property owners about the incorporation process. State law requires that all affected landowners be given notice and opportunity to object. Second, their claim of public benefit is suspect. A community corridor that primarily benefits luxury home buyers is not the same as a legitimate public infrastructure project." I felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. "So we can fight this." "We can fight it," Sarah said. "But I need you to understand what you are getting into. My retainer is $25,000, and this case could easily cost you $50,000 or more before it is over. Even if we win, you will probably never recover those costs." $25,000. That was almost half of my retirement savings. But what choice did I have? Without my land, I would have nothing anyway. "Let's do it," I said. Sarah nodded and pulled out a legal pad. "Good. The first thing we need to do is file an injunction to stop any further surveying or development activities on your property. Then we need to challenge the legal basis for the HOA's incorporation and their claimed authority over your land." Within a week, the HOA responded with their own legal escalation. They filed a lien against my property, claiming I owed them $15,000 in community development fees that I had never agreed to pay. They also initiated condemnation proceedings, arguing that my refusal to cooperate was delaying a project that would benefit the entire community. The psychological warfare was relentless. Corinne Matthews organized a media campaign, giving interviews to local newspapers and television stations where she portrayed me as a selfish landowner who was blocking progress and harming property values for everyone else in the area. "All we are asking for is reasonable cooperation," she told Channel 7 News. "Mr. Johnson's refusal to work with the community is preventing us from creating infrastructure that would benefit everyone, including him." I watched the news report from my cabin, feeling sick to my stomach. The reporter made it sound like I was the villain, holding up a beneficial community project out of pure stubbornness. There was no mention of the fact that they wanted to take more than half of my property without compensation. The stress was eating me alive. I was losing weight, not sleeping, and jumping at every sound in the woods. My savings account was bleeding money to pay legal fees, and every day brought new threats and demands from the HOA. But then Sarah called with news that changed everything. "I found something," she said, her voice excited. "I have been going through the county records, and there are some serious procedural violations in how the Pine Ridge HOA was incorporated. They did not follow the proper notification requirements, and their incorporation documents contain false statements about the scope of their authority." "What does that mean?" "It means their entire legal foundation is built on quicksand. If we can prove that their incorporation was invalid, then they have no authority over your property at all. I am filing a motion to invalidate their entire organization." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we might actually have a chance. But I also knew that wounded animals are the most dangerous, and Corinne Matthews was not going to give up without a fight. The real battle was just beginning. The news of my legal counterattack spread through the community like wildfire. Within days of Sarah filing our motion to invalidate the HOA, my phone started ringing with calls from neighbors I had never met. They had stories that made my blood boil. Jim Peterson, my neighbor, was the first to reach out. "I should have warned you earlier," he said when he stopped by my cabin. "They tried the same thing on me last year, claimed they needed part of my property for a community garden. When I refused, they made my life hell for 6 months." "What happened?" "I eventually sold out and moved to Florida. I could not afford to fight them in court, and the harassment was making my wife sick. We lost about $40,000 on the sale." More calls followed. Maria Santos, whose family had owned a small horse farm for 20 years, told me how the HOA had forced her to remove her barn because it did not meet their architectural guidelines. When she refused, they fined her $500 a day until she complied. Tom Bradley, a retired mechanic, described how they had tried to force him to tear down his workshop because it was not compatible with the community's aesthetic vision. He had spent $15,000 on legal fees before finally giving up and demolishing the building himself. The pattern was clear. The Pine Ridge HOA was systematically targeting long-time residents who owned property that interfered with their development plans. They used legal harassment, financial pressure, and social intimidation to force people to comply with their demands. But something was different this time. Instead of fighting alone, we were connecting with each other. Word spread through phone calls, social media, and conversations at the local grocery store. People who had been intimidated into silence were starting to speak up. Sarah Chen helped us organize a legal strategy. If we can demonstrate a pattern of abuse and show that the HOA was incorporated specifically to facilitate this kind of land grab, we can challenge their entire authority. she explained during a meeting at the community center. 12 people showed up to that first meeting. By the second meeting, we had 25. By the third, we had packed the room with more than 50 residents who had been affected by the HOA's tactics. Corinne Matthews was clearly panicking. The HOA started sending out threatening letters to anyone who attended our meetings, claiming that organizing against them was a violation of community covenants. They hired a private investigator to follow me and take pictures of everyone who visited my property. But their intimidation tactics backfired. Every heavy-handed response just made more people angry and more willing to fight back. When they tried to fine Maria Santos for hosting a meeting at her house, 10 more families joined our cause. The breakthrough came when Tom Bradley remembered something important. "I recorded some of my phone calls with Corinne Matthews," he told us at a meeting. "I was afraid she was going to lie about what was said, so I started recording everything." The recordings were devastating. In one call, Corinne could be heard telling Tom that the HOA had ways of making life very difficult for people who do not cooperate. In another, she admitted that the primary purpose of the community corridor was to increase property values for the luxury development. But the most damaging recording was a conversation between Corinne and David, Kim, that Tom had captured when they did not realize his phone was still recording. They discussed their strategy for targeting the holdouts and making examples of people who refused to comply. "We need to make it clear that resistance is futile," Corinne's voice said through the tinny speaker. "If we can break Johnson, the others will fall in line." When Sarah heard the recordings, she smiled for the first time since I had met her. "This is exactly what we needed. These recordings prove that the HOA was engaged in systematic harassment and intimidation, which invalidates their claims of acting in the public interest." We had turned the corner. The HOA was no longer hunting us individually. Now we were hunting them collectively, and they were running scared. The final confrontation was scheduled for the next HOA board meeting, which was required by law to be open to the public. We were going to pack that room and demand answers. Corinne Matthews had no idea what was coming. The Pine Ridge Community Center had never seen anything like it. By 6:30, 30 minutes before the scheduled HOA board meeting, every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. The energy in the room was electric, like a crowd gathering for a boxing match where everyone knew the underdog had a real chance to win. I sat in the front row with Sarah Chen on my left and Jim Peterson on my right. Behind us, the room was packed with faces I had come to know over the past month. Maria Santos with her husband and teenage daughter, Tom Bradley with his recording equipment, dozens of other residents who had been bullied, harassed, or intimidated by the Pine Ridge HOA. Corinne Matthews entered the room at exactly 7 o'clock, flanked by David Kim and Robert Wheeler. She looked around at the packed room, and I saw something I had never seen before in her eyes: fear. "Good evening," she said, her voice not quite as confident as usual. "This is a regularly scheduled board meeting of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. We have a full agenda tonight, so I would ask that any public comments be kept brief." I stood up. "Actually, Corinne, we have some things to discuss that might take a while." Her face went pale. "This is a board meeting, Mr. Johnson. It is not a public forum for your grievances." Sarah stood up beside me. "Actually, under state law, all HOA meetings must allow for public comment. My client has some information that the board needs to hear." Corinne looked like she wanted to bolt from the room, but she was trapped by her own procedures. Very well, you have 5 minutes. I walked to the front of the room, turned to face the crowd, and began to speak. 6 months ago, most of us had never heard of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. We were living our lives peacefully on our own property, minding our own business. Then Karen Matthews and her associates showed up and started demanding that we surrender our land, our rights, and our freedom to their vision of community development. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. They told us it was for the community good. They told us it was legal. They told us we had no choice but to comply. But what they did not tell us was that their entire organization is built on lies and procedural violations. I nodded to Sarah, who stepped forward with a thick folder. The Pine Ridge HOA was incorporated in violation of state law. They failed to provide proper notice to existing property owners. They made false claims about their authority. And most importantly, they have engaged in systematic harassment and intimidation of anyone who dared to question their demands. Sarah opened the folder and began reading from the legal documents. According to county records, the Pine Ridge HOA claimed to represent a community of 300 homes. But at the time of incorporation, only 12 homes existed in the area. They claimed to be acting in the public interest, but their own internal communications show that their primary goal was to increase property values for a luxury development. The room erupted in angry voices. People were shouting questions and accusations at the board members who looked like they wanted to disappear. Furthermore, Sarah continued, we have evidence that the HOA has engaged in criminal harassment of residents who refuse to comply with their demands. Illegal surveillance, fraudulent liens, and threats of violence. Karen finally found her voice. These are serious accusations, and I resent the implication that our board has acted improperly. We have always operated within the law. That was when Tom Bradley stood up with his phone in his hand. Really, Karen? Because I have recordings that say otherwise. The room fell silent. Karen's face went white. Tom pressed play on his phone, and Karen's voice filled the room. We need to make it clear that resistance is futile. If we can break Johnson, the others will fall in line. The reaction was immediate and explosive. People jumped to their feet, shouting demands for Karen's resignation. Several people were recording with their phones, and I could see Karen realizing that this moment was going to follow her for the rest of her life. Those recordings were made illegally, she said, her voice shaking. They cannot be used as evidence of anything. Actually, Sarah said with a smile, this is a one-party consent state. Tom had every right to record his conversations with you, and these recordings will be presented as evidence in our lawsuit to invalidate your entire organization. David Kim leaned over and whispered something in Karen's ear. She nodded and stood up. I think there may have been some misunderstandings about the scope of our authority, she said. Perhaps we should consider putting the community corridor project on hold while we review the relevant legal requirements. The room erupted in boos and catcalls. Too late for that, someone shouted. We demand your resignation, yelled another voice. Karen looked around the room at the angry faces and realized that her reign of terror was over. I hereby resign as president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, effective immediately. David Kim and Robert Wheeler quickly followed suit, resigning their positions and rushing out of the room like their pants were on fire. I stood in the front of the room, looking at the crowd of neighbors who had stood up to institutional bullying and won. We had done something that none of us could have accomplished alone. We had fought back against corruption and won. The Pine Ridge HOA was finished, and my forest was safe. 6 months later, I was sitting on my porch with my morning coffee, watching the deer graze in the meadow. The same meadow that Karen Matthews had tried to steal for her community corridor. The same meadow that was now permanently protected by a conservation easement I had established with Sarah Chen's help. The legal aftermath had been swift and decisive. The court invalidated the Pine Ridge HOA's incorporation, ruling that it had been created through fraudulent means and had operated outside the bounds of state law. Karen Matthews and her associates faced criminal charges for harassment, fraud, and abuse of process. The financial settlement was more than I had ever dreamed possible. The developers behind the HOA were forced to pay damages to all the residents they had harassed and intimidated. My settlement alone was enough to pay off my legal fees and leave me with more money than I had started with. But the money was not the most important thing. The most important thing was that I was still here in my cabin, surrounded by my 15 acres of forest that no one could ever take away from me again. Jim Peterson stopped by that morning, as he did most mornings now. We had become close friends during the fight, bonded by our shared experience of standing up to bullies. "Beautiful morning," he said, settling into the chair next to mine. "Every morning is beautiful when you wake up on your own land," I replied. We sat in comfortable silence, watching a hawk circle overhead. The forest was alive with sounds I had missed during the months of stress and legal battles. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, the distant sound of the creek flowing over the rocks. "You know," Jim said, "I never thought we could win. When you first started fighting them, I thought you were crazy to take on people with that much money and power." I smiled. I thought I was crazy too, but sometimes you have to fight even when you know you might lose. Some things are worth fighting for. Your forest definitely was. I looked out at the trees that surrounded us, thinking about how close I had come to losing all of this. The hiking trails where I walked every morning, the creek where I caught trout for dinner, the meadow where the deer felt safe enough to bring their bobbies. It was not just about the forest, I said. It was about the principle. These people thought they could just take whatever they wanted because they had money and lawyers. They thought ordinary people like us would just roll over and let them do whatever they pleased. Well, they learned different. The conservation easement meant that my land would remain undeveloped forever. Even after I was gone, no one would be able to build houses or shopping centers or community corridors on these 15 acres. The forest would remain a forest, and the deer would continue to graze in the meadow. I had also established a legal fund to help other property owners who faced similar situations. The Pine Ridge case had attracted national attention, and I was getting calls from people all over the country who were dealing with abusive HOAs and corrupt local officials. Sarah Chen had started a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting municipal overreach and protecting property rights. She used our victory as a model for other cases, showing that ordinary citizens could stand up to institutional bullying and win. The developers who had backed the Pine Ridge HOA eventually built their luxury homes on the land they already owned. But without the community corridor through my property, the development was much less profitable than they had planned. Several of them lost money on the project, which gave me a deep sense of satisfaction. Karen Matthews had moved away from the area, but not before facing criminal charges for harassment and fraud. She pleaded guilty to lesser charges and was sentenced to community service and probation. I never saw her again, but I heard she was working at a real estate office in another state, hopefully with a much better understanding of property rights. As I sat on my porch that morning, I thought about the lessons I had learned from this experience. The most important lesson was that you cannot fight institutional corruption alone, but you do not have to. There are always other people who are facing the same problems, and when you stand up together, you can accomplish things that seem impossible. The second lesson was that bullies, no matter how powerful they appear, are fundamentally cowards. Corinne Matthews and her associates were tough when they thought they were picking on isolated individuals, but they crumbled as soon as they faced organized resistance. The third lesson was that the law, when properly applied, is still on the side of ordinary citizens. The system is not perfect, but it can still protect people who are willing to stand up for their rights. I finished my coffee and stood up to begin my morning walk through the forest. The same forest that would be here long after I was gone, protected forever from people who thought they could take whatever they wanted. My forest, my sanctuary, my home. Free forever,